You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Compernell. Before the ceasefire was announced Tuesday night, the war in Iran had effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passageway for ships that before the war carried a fifth of the world's oil supply. The consequent spike in global commodity prices has reinvigorated inflation concerns and pushed major central banks to consider hiking rates later this year. As the war continues to evolve, investors will be laser-focused on whether the strait sustainably reopens and what the world can do in the meantime to make up the shortfall in production. On today's special edition of Simply Put, we talk with geopolitical analyst Rachel Ziemba about the importance of the Strait of Hormuz in global commodity markets, how its recent disruptions will impact U.S. consumer prices, and what it will take for traffic to sustainably normalize. For complete context, the interview was conducted the afternoon of Monday, April 6th, one day before the U.S. and Iran announced a 2-week ceasefire. All right, on to the interview. Our guest today is Rachel Ziemba, geopolitical analyst and founder of Ziemba Insights. Rachel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Our topic today is the Strait of Hormuz, the role it plays in global markets and how commodity prices will evolve as the war in Iran continues. So, as we've all learned the last 6 weeks, the Strait of Hormuz is this narrow waterway connecting the Persian or Arabian Gulf to the world's oceans. And ever since February 28th, when the U.S. and Israel began their aerial attacks against Iran, it has been more or less shut. So, Rachel, walk us through how important the strait was as of February 27th, the pre-war world, for global commodities. What were the main products traveling through it, and how important was this traffic as a share of global supply for the various products?
The Strait of Hormuz has always been a kind of key choke point that energy market analysts like myself have studied and thought through the scenarios. So, oil and oil products, liquefied natural gas are some of the key ones. And so as of, end of February, 20% approximately of global oil production, crude oil, but also oil products was transiting the straits. About 20%, so that's almost 21 million barrels a day. Of oil and oil products. Then you layer on about 20% of global LNG supplies, liquefied natural gas. Qatar is one of the largest producers, and almost 30% of seaborne fertilizer. There's also fertilizer that's carried via rail and road, especially here in the United States. It comes from Canada. But anyway, we're talking about over 20% of global fertilizer products. And then other products, 15% or so of global aluminum and helium, which is a byproduct of natural gas production that is used in making MRIs and making chip that we use everywhere. And another important byproduct is sulfur, which we use as a reagent to break down metal processing. So lots of different key commodities were effectively trapped. Even though volumes have started to trickle through, this is still one of the most meaningful supply shocks in energy markets that we've seen.
I think you touched on a lot of important non-energy commodities because sometimes, understandably, people see the sticker shock for a gallon of gas and everyone's following crude oil prices, but there's so much more that can pass through to different consumer prices. And we're going to get into some of those details in just a bit. But again, going back to that February 27th world, what were the main destinations of all these ships, and how long would they take to complete their journeys?
You have countries like South Korea and Japan and China and India, and across all of these products. You have a number of Asian countries that were getting 70 to 80% of their oil and oil products from the Gulf. And it wasn't all one country. You have several major energy producers lining the Gulf. And so some countries thought, okay, well, we can diversify. We can buy from Saudi Arabia. We can buy from Iraq. We can buy from the UAE. But the problem is with this choke point, supplies from several different countries were all constrained. Now, how long does it take? It depends a little bit on the destination. but we're talking about usually 3 weeks to a month and a half. There are cargoes that left the strait before the war started that were going to Asia, have mostly all reached their destination. But there are some cargoes that were headed to the Americas that have not yet reached their destination yet. If we start to think about a scenario where maybe there's a ceasefire and there's some agreement coming to pass, imagine, you have to start that clock of when things could restart. You are talking about a matter of months, not days. That's not even counting any reconstruction or repairs that might need to happen.
So those countries, especially in Asia, that are dependent on these ships from the strait, does that help explain why we've seen a divergence in certain oil benchmarks or natural gas benchmarks? Because, if the strait takes a few weeks or a month to complete its journey and the logistics are set up, you can't just reroute these ships, on the turn of a dime. Is that what explains the divergence in prices for a lot of these benchmarks? And should we expect all those prices to converge over time?
It does partly explain the difference. Also, in the United States, for example, we get very little energy directly from the Gulf. There might be a few rare products. But what's happening here is that some of the buyers that can no longer get oil from the Middle East are snapping up whatever supplies they can get. And so it puts more competition on other barrels. We've been talking about where we were at the end of February, but where we are today is a loss of 10 to maybe 12 million barrels a day of oil and oil products that are just not coming onto the market. And that's about 10% of global oil consumption. So that's a pretty sizable chunk. And oil typically is priced at the marginal barrel. You're right, we've seen oil for physical delivery in Asia much more expensive than those for physical delivery here in the United States. And so we should, over time, expect to see some convergence. But there's another factor as well, and that not all oil is the same. Typically, we think about oil being fungible, price that sort of is set globally, but different weights of oil and types of oil do better at creating certain products. So, for example, medium sort of weight crude tends to lend itself to making diesel and distillates. Lighter, sweeter crude makes other products, and refineries might be attuned to one or the other. So it's not that every barrel is exactly interchangeably or not interchangeably efficiently. So that's another factor that's been driving it. So in terms of where we headed, I would anticipate prices in the short term for short-term delivery will converge.
Outside of oil, which, as I understand it, can be kept on these ships and find their way to, the highest bidder, what about the other products you talked about, like fertilizer or natural gas? Can they be traded globally, or are these logistics more of a friction that stop global prices for them converging?
So they can be traded globally. The issue is just that there's a shortage. What started to happen a couple days, definitely a week into this conflict, was that as the strait was closed, producers started to shut in production or scale back production just because they were going to run out of storage. They could be traded elsewhere, but the point is just that new supplies are not being produced, new vessels are not showing up to be loaded, and so that gap builds up over time. From a fertilizer perspective, there are some alternatives, different types of fertilizer. And the other thing I think that is relevant where liquefied natural gas is concerned is over time, some of the particles evaporate. There might be less of the product there when it shows up than if it had gone about its normal course.
Yeah, it sort of spoils like a carton of milk or something. It doesn't kind of have an infinite shelf life, so to speak.
Yes, thankfully it lasts longer than a carton of milk,
Right.
but but good analogy.
You mentioned how the disruption to global oil supply is close to 10 to 12 million barrels a day now, but that is smaller than the 20% that you said at the beginning of the interview. So it sounds like there are some short term solutions, or maybe not short term, but sort of fixes to help cushion the blow from that disruption so we don't effectively have everything eliminated from global supply that used to go through the strait. So, what are some of those fixes and how sustained can they continue to go on?
So there was 21 million barrels a day of oil and products that were transiting. Now, there are a couple of countries that have alternate ways to get their products to market, most notably Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have alternate pipelines. They can get maybe half of their production to market. So Saudi Arabia has the East West pipeline. It has a capacity of 7 million barrels a day, but the ports that it goes to only have a capacity of about 4.5, 5. But, that's 4.5, 5 million barrels a day that would otherwise be shut in. The Emiratis can process about 1.8 million barrels a day through their pipeline that goes to Fujairah. Now, both of these ports and alternate options have their own challenges. The port at Yanbu, that's the terminus of the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia. If you're sending oil to Asia from there, you have to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Houthis in Yemen at times blocked that passageway. It's, of course, a longer journey to Asia than other routes. Now, Iran itself was producing several million barrels a day, and that production is mostly continuing. And then there's about a million barrels a day that's going from Iraq. So you add it up, and you're looking at about 10 million barrels a day that is still making it to market through other channels, and then 10 million or 11 million barrels a day that is shut in. Now, we're also, irrespective of what's going on in the Middle East, in this time period, we've also seen some drone attacks and capacity attacks on Russia's exports. So Russian exports are down as well. There's still a war going on there between Russia and Ukraine, even if sometimes it's hard to remember that. The other thing that's happened that has cushioned the blow is that a number of countries got together and released oil from their strategic petroleum reserves. And about almost 4 million barrels a day can come on the market at once from that. There's a total of over 400 million barrels that is being released from this. And so that, sort of provided some additional flows. Now, eventually those are going to run out in a few weeks' time. So if the strait remains closed, that's going to add up. There is a final almost source of stockpile that the U.S. has encouraged people to tap, and that has been the stranded barrels and cargoes loaded of sanctioned Iranian and Russian oil. Those had been stranded in part because of a tightening of sanctions, and when India in particular stopped buying as much Russian oil towards the end of last year and beginning of this year. But that's sort of a one-off driver. So there have been a variety of factors that make this extensive crisis a little less painful. At best, we're looking at a flow of oil and oil products to the market that's at least 7 million barrels a day lower than it was. And that's a much bigger outage than we saw, for example, in past crises. It's much larger than the outage and rerouting that we saw in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine war and the like.
Increasing production in regions that are outside of the Middle East, it takes time, it's expensive, and it's risky. I mean, all these producers don't know if oil prices are going to go back down to $65, $70 a barrel, so I understand there's some hesitation. But to what extent can U.S. shale producers, they're often called swing producers, so to what extent can they further add production to kind of smooth out these disruptions we've seen?
The U.S. shale has the benefit that when you drill, typically there's a lot of production at the beginning, right? A lot of other times it might take you years to bring new supplies onto the market. What's happening right now is, yes, there is a bit more drilling. For the last couple of years, US producers that had the capacity to scale up and produce natural gas and natural gas liquids were better able to cover their costs. And those who were producing oil and oil products were near their break-even points and were not incentivized to drill more. So I would anticipate we would see a little bit of additional supply, but it's not something that can turn on a dime. A lot of U.S. producers that are LNG adjacent, liquefied natural gas adjacent, will be a little more upbeat, partly because they will be looking and saying, well, even if the conflict ended today, and then you have a few months of sort of new routes, vessels being repositioned and other things being done, there's been physical damage to Qatari oil, sort of LNG export capacity, which means that you might have several years of production declines. The challenge, though, is for a lot of these producers, even with LNG, is this worry about what the demand is going to look like in the future. Costs have gone up a lot. People are choosing, if they can, to make shorter journeys to not have to pay the full cost. I would anticipate that there will be some more electric vehicles, for example, sold in the coming months. And so I know a number of producers are concerned about the medium-term demand for their products. So that's going to make them a little bit more cautious. We have been seeing an inching up of production from Venezuela after a range of both sanctions relief as well as some policy changes in Venezuela after the seizure of Maduro and the change at the very top in Venezuela. But that's going to be in the neighborhood of a few 100,000 barrels a day, not millions of barrels a day by the end of the year.
As we're recording on the afternoon of April 6th, West Texas Intermediate and Brent are trading both around about $110. Their futures markets are also backward dated, which means investors generally think that prices are going to come down in the future. Based on everything that we've talked about, do you think those oil prices and their futures markets accurately reflect how the war is going to evolve? Is there any over optimism or over pessimism, or do you think that pricing is basically right?
I think markets are struggling to figure out how long this is going to last and how large the pain will be. I think where there's probably still a bit of over optimism is especially looking for a couple of months out or even early 2027 contracts that are sort of pricing that this will be a sharp, pain point now, but that there will be, adjustments fairly quickly and that the strait will reopen and production will come back online. I could see oil prices remaining higher for the next year than is currently priced in the market. And I could also anticipate that as the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, if production remains locked in a few weeks' time, in a month's time, when we when the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases might start to wear down, that could be a point that markets would have to price in. Market actors are still thinking that this might be a conflict that persists for another couple of weeks. We're watching, I think, very closely to what extent the trickle of vessels out from the strait starts to pick up. Iran has sort of set up a call to be in control of who goes in and out of the strait. There's some talk about a toll booth and countries being selected or sellers being selected to send their vessels through. I'd be watching, for example, whether the new exemption for Iraq that was announced over the weekend, just a couple of days ago, will that lead to a circumstance where vessels are willing to come back in and Iraq's oil shut-in might become less extensive. So if that were to be the case, and you were seeing several million barrels a day coming back online, getting priced in, then that would be the kind of circumstance you could say, well, okay, well, markets might need to adjust and maybe they're a little pessimistic at this time. But if anything, things are still tilted a bit more towards over optimism rather than over pessimism.
What would it take for the price of oil to get to $150 or $200 a barrel? I mean, those strategic reserves, of course, dwindle at some point, or at least countries' willingness to draw down on them. You read analysts predicting oil will go that high. Is that just sensationalism to get some attention and it's a tail risk? Or is there something plausible that would happen where we could really see things escalate even further from here and oil gets that expensive?
So I guess the catalyst I'd be watching for further moves up are not only this SPR release, fading, but also if there was either new damage that made it difficult for another major oil producer to produce, or Saudi Arabia, for example, to send oil through an alternate channel. So I'm watching where the Houthis are with the choke point at the Bab el-Mandeb. Also, could there be sort of more permanent damage, not just to infrastructure, such that we would have to price in significant volumes of oil remaining offline, not just for a few weeks or a few months, but if it could take a year to come back online? I've been tracking and forecasting the energy markets for almost 20 years now. I mean, there's a lot of models you can come up with. Those that I think are more sort of credible in this circumstance might say that we've got 10% or so of oil offline, could look at, oil grinding up on average a few dollars a day as this sort of outage becomes larger. But oil is based on both fundamental prices, but also risk perception. So I do think sometimes when people come up with a $150 target, or those who say, oh, it could go to 200, and of course it could go to 200, but it's not going to stay at 200, because at 150, 160, 170, whatever number you're going to come up with, there's also going to be significant demand destruction, maybe temporary, based on price. I mean, right now we're already starting to see some demand destruction, especially in Asia, because the prices are going up, but also because there are direct policies from governments trying to discourage civil servants from driving, for example, in certain countries. So I think in those sort of circumstances, you would see over time some demand destruction. And some of that demand destruction might be temporary, but some of it could be more permanent, especially the use of oil products for electricity and the like. And then the risk, as I said, of shifting to more electric vehicles, you could see that shuttering.
Do you see the countries that are most vulnerable from these energy price shocks are the ones that are the most energy intensive? Do you have any countries on your radar that you think if this goes on much longer, there's a recession?
So the energy intensity, and then also importers that have already sizable external deficits or fiscal deficits, especially if it's a country that's subsidizing fuel. I mean, I think there's a number of countries where maybe not a recession, but we could see a meaningful slowdown. I think we'll see that in a number of Asian economies. I'm watching India. I'm not expecting necessarily a recession. I'm also watching places like Turkey, sort of a number of African countries. And I would expect a number of countries that maybe they avoid a recession, but they're going to need to pass on those higher costs to their consumers. So, for example, if you're a buyer of electronics from Asia, which we've been buying a lot of electronics from Asia for many decades, and especially over the last year, an AI data center, for example, you could see it filtering through in that way. And I think we could see a number of countries where there's meaningful slowdowns. And then, of course, you don't just destroy demand for oil and gas, you might have factories shuttering or producing at lower levels. And this is something where, sort of Asia is the epicenter now. but some of the costs are sort of spreading to Europe. And in the United States, it's probably what's a good greater risk would be some kind of stagflationary scenario rather than a recession. But we could see both a slowdown in growth and an increase in inflationary pressures.
That's an interesting way to show how U.S. consumers are exposed to the energy dependency of Asia on the Gulf region because we import a lot of goods from that region. And if it's energy intensive manufacturing, then they're going to pass along the cost to their buyers, which are U.S. consumers. And that leads me to my next question, which is that we talked about how these ships take many weeks to complete their journeys, and so I imagine there was a lot of supply already out at sea on February 28th. Fertilizer, of course, is at the start of agricultural production, and so any increase in its costs won't reflect food already on the shelves at the grocery stores. That's just one example of how we're not going to see the energy price spike have immediate impacts on consumer prices. But walk us through the ways that these disruptions we've talked about will have lagged impacts on U.S. consumer prices.
The food side is an interesting one because US farmers have been struggling with lower earnings over the last few years as some major buyers, including China, have been buying less. And so, one of the challenges here farmers are facing is they might be facing a higher cost for fertilizer. And can they make it back with passing on those costs? Some of the more commodified food products, it may be more difficult. This is really a distinction. It's a bit different than during 2022 when Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine really led to a big disruption of both fertilizer and grain. So, both the input, fertilizer, and the output, the grain, were both restricted. So, it was a bit easier for farmers, especially in the United States or just in the Western Hemisphere more generally, to take advantage. They were a little bit better positioned. I'm worried more about the dynamics of various African countries and in India, where food is a bigger part of the consumer basket than it is here in the United States. But consumer electronics and other products would face not only the cost of energy intensive industry, but also shortfalls of key products like helium is used in the production of the sterile environments used to make semiconductors, right? Which are in almost anything we touch these days. Hopefully not, maybe not our clothes, but almost everything else. Memory chip prices were already going up in cost. The other thing is anything plastic. Plastics are made from petrochemicals. The cost of plastic bottle of Coke, for example, might become more costly. Think about bottled liquids. Producers have already faced higher cost of aluminum for their canned products, and now they would be facing higher plastics costs. Now, some of that, and then we use chemicals in pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of potential downstream effects here for the US consumer, many of which would only take months, maybe even, a year or so to sort of come through the pipeline.
We've talked a lot about the effects on crude oil, but personally speaking, as a consumer, I've never bought a barrel of crude oil. I buy the refined products. And so it's one thing for there to be disruption to global supply of crude oil, but is there anything about the Gulf and what it provides to these global markets as far as refining that complicates it even further? We talk about 10 million barrels or so of crude oil taken off the global market, but do we have less plastic, less of those microchips or the helium? I mean, walk us through the different ways that the refined products themselves could potentially have more dire shortages than crude itself.
We already are in a circumstance where some of the oil products are actually in shorter supply than crude itself. Jet fuel, for example, has been the one from almost day one that experts I spoke to were really worried about. We don't store a ton of jet fuels. It's just harder to store. Diesel and other key oil products actually have much bigger increases in price than crude oil. Why is this the case? There's some important large refineries in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia that are not able to get their supplies out. Saudi Arabia, for example, and its alternate exports is mostly exporting crude oil. It's not exporting products. And as I say, this large new refinery is offline. And, this is partly a trend that we've seen in a lot of countries like the United States and places in Europe and Australia and elsewhere. We have a lot of developed economies have been shuttering refineries, and we import refined products from other places. Australia, for example, has been scrambling for refined products that they used to buy from South Korea or Singapore or other sort of places that have refineries or selling points. So that's already something that's tight and will be important going ahead. And as you say, very few people buy crude oil. That's not what you fill your car or your generator or what airplanes are filled with. The product shortfalls are already more painful, but that will probably build over time. Now, there's also been a bit of adjustment because look, from day one, even though refineries knew that there was still oil on its way, that, you've got to look ahead. You can't just do just-in-time production and processing. And so as, for example, refineries in India are running it at full tilt as they can to produce cooking gas that is used extensively in India, they're also producing a bit of a surplus of jet fuel and gasoline that they're selling on to others. So there's some new swaps going on. But at the end of the day, if we have this shortfall of crude oil building up, and we have this loss of products. If there's not enough crude oil, then refineries will have to go down to some lower level of production. So, and that's where I would really be watching. Where are we in mid-April? Is there some prospect of some additional supply, sort of reopening or some sort of new normal, maybe not the full levels, or some prospect of starting to get parts of the system back up and running? And if not, then I think we could be in for a very difficult summer in many parts of the global economy.
The average cost for a gallon of gasoline has already gone up $1. We've talked a lot about how some of the energy price impacts are going to have lagged pass through. So among other things, this is a political issue. We have midterm elections coming up in November. Why is it so hard for the U.S. to use military or unilateral de-escalation to reopen the strait? Because it seems like we've had President Trump and U.S. military leaders look at that increase in gas prices and everything else and say, okay, we've got to do something about this. But it's not just up to the U.S. Whenever those announcements were made, there's only been a partial retracement in financial markets. So what's stopping the U.S. being able to do this on its own?
I think there are limitations of doing this fully on a military level. Some of it is that the United States talks about wanting to do something and then talks about having more military and strategic objectives that still need to be achieved. I will say that I think global oil benchmarks have been quite sensitive to, the president's statements of, that seem to be seeking off ramps. Some of it, I think, is about military technology and, asymmetric power, the development of drones, for example, and decentralized nature of even missile technology in Iran. This is something we were seeing already in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the sort of role of autonomous drones and the ability to inflict quite a fair amount of damage in that context. And so that may be just part of new military engagements going forward, this sort of asymmetry that is a function of changes in innovation. Now, look, the US government has done a lot of damage to Iran's navy, its official military. It's definitely killed some leaders, but this is also not something that the U.S. can just unilaterally stop the war. Iran has to also stop, retaliatory or other attacks. The other challenges here, I mean, I think in the early days of the war, there was a lot of discussion about was the way to reopen the strait some sort of military escort system. That's still something I think the US military has thought about, but they didn't necessarily have all the military hardware in place. But the other challenge is this is a fairly lengthy, narrow passage. So you might need quite a lot of military technology in fortified areas to guarantee that this route would sort of reopen. What's probably most important is getting to a ceasefire in the broader war. And then the other thing markets will have to watch for is what the new system will be for fuel out of the Strait of Hormuz. Will this now be a circumstance where Iran will be taking tolls? This war, I think, has created a circumstance where Iran could lay claim and additional leverage to transit channels in a way that was only a threat and maybe not a super credible threat before this particular conflict. And that's the sort of thing that might mean that there's a longer standing risk premium that remains in place on oil and other products that come from sort of inside the Gulf.
Do you think a ceasefire in and of itself would normalize traffic in the Strait? I mean, if I am operating one of those ships, I might not be able to get insurance still. And Iran has claimed that they laid a bunch of mines in that sea, and I don't know if they're lying or not, but I wouldn't want to try to call their bluff. So do you see traffic normalizing anytime soon, even if there is a ceasefire today?
I don't think that the strait automatically opens up as President Trump thought and sort of indicated in his speech of last week. It doesn't automatically open up because there's a ceasefire, but I do think a ceasefire might provide the space to then, negotiate about reopening. Now, the challenge, and it could happen as part of a ceasefire negotiation or it could happen elsewhere. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how much insurance is a limiting factor. There was clearly a period of time where a lot of political risk insurance, war premium insurance were canceled. They were very quickly then reinstated, but at much higher levels. Now, insurance is maybe, sort of 5x what it used to be. Oil prices have gone up so much that they would still be, one would still be making a fair amount of money. But the issue is not just about can you get insurance, but it's actually that physical risk of what if you had to call on that insurance. I think there's a binary risk assessment here. Either, there's a fairly credible chance of making it out safely, or the fact that there is insurance on the cargo is not going to make a lot of difference. So I think there's still a lot of concern. Now, that being said, some ship owners and ships captains are taking that risk. Some of them are cutting side deals with Iran. There's a lot of negotiations going on, but it also depends a lot, hour by hour and day by day here, that there might seem to be more traffic picking up than there are attacks and explosions. On the mining side, one of the things that can be challenging is fully mining the strait might impair Iran's own ability to export. And I think that one of the big maybe misconceptions that some people in the market and even in strategic thinking, hadn't factored in was that it would be as relatively easy for Iran to close the strait as it's been. There were a lot of people in the marketplace that thought, well, Iran can't close the strait because then their supplies would be shut in. And in a sense, because of real serious security risks, whether it's coming from drones or missiles or otherwise, that the risk reward is just not there for many people. So we'll see how that plays out. But I don't think we go back to normal. I think there's both going to be more, at best, more elevated risk premia. The Gulf countries wouldn't be happy about a circumstance where Iran gets to decide who goes through and who doesn't, or sort of paying a fee for that. But so far, we don't have a move towards what a new system might look like. I don't think you put sort of the monsters back into Pandora's box after this. But I've written a little bit about some of these dynamics at my Substack, Weaponized Economy, about the Strait of Hormuz disorder, which I'd be happy to chat with anyone about.
Rachel Ziemba, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.